Okay, so to jump into some stories and make it a little more concrete. Actually, my first story is about somebody who had a pretty normative gender identity and a pretty normative experience in his gender growing up. This person was called, I call him Ben, that's not his real name, but I call him Ben. He's Southeast Asian. And this is actually not an asylum story, but because sex designation on documents so often becomes an issue for intersex people, I thought it was an important one to bring in. Ben was already legally in the country when I met him. He was applying for citizenship. He was born with ambiguous genitals. I don't know his medical diagnosis. I don't know if he ever had one. And his birth certificate labeled him as female. What that means is that in the Southeast Asian country where he was born, whoever attended his birth, and I don't know who that was or where that was, took a look at his body and decided female. And sometime shortly after that, his parents or perhaps some doctors, someone decided that no, actually he should be raised as male. And he was raised as male all his life. He lived unproblematically as male. He had no problem with that gender designation. Everybody accepted him for that. Nobody looked at his birth certificate for a very long time until he came to this country and was trying to immigrate. And then, I don't know if he even knew, but then he had this F on his birth certificate, and it didn't fit with his whole life story, and it didn't fit with his lived experience and his lived identity. And when he tried to get the change on the documentation, what we heard back from immigration was they wanted a test to prove that he was male. And this particular immigration officer settled on that he had to have a chromosome test. So it said, we'll change your sex designation if you bring us a chromosome test and show us that you have a Y chromosome. So he didn't want to do that. He thought that was invasive, and I thought it was too, and inappropriate. It's quite possible that he did not have a Y chromosome, and so the test would have helped him and might have made things worse. And so our argument with immigration was, first of all, that they were trying to use a framework that was built for transsexual people, and that intersexuality is not transsexuality, and that that's not what they were dealing with here in this case. And I often bring that point up because it can help people understand what I'm talking about. And because there are a lot of roadblocks set up for the transgender community, and that's not fair, but sometimes our intersex clients can bypass those roadblocks. I also pointed out that the chromosome pattern is not considered medically definitive in these cases. That a doctor, even if this person had XX chromosomes, a doctor might say they're still a man, and might have said at the beginning that he should have been assigned as a boy. The standard medical practice is to assign the sex based on the predicted psychological outcome and to correct the sex designation if there's an error. And that is indeed the international consensus standard now for gender assignment in intersex cases. I also pointed out that there was no federal law or regulation I was aware of that defined sex in terms of chromosomes. So often people go to that chromosome test. This is one of those people believe what they think. People think, well, I know what sex really is. It's really chromosomes. And so if we have to prove something, we can go to the chromosome test. But that's not in the law anywhere that I can find, except that one case in Texas, but that's not gonna last. And that case specifically excluded intersex people. And so we said, you know, there is no real law on this. Medicine doesn't look at chromosomes definitively, and that the legal approach should remain consistent with the standard medical protocol. And we were then able to get his gender designation changed on his documents, so now he has a consistent identity that he can present. So the take-home points from that story are, first of all, that it can be helpful to distinguish physical intersex conditions from transsexuality. In some cases, it may be helpful to note physical features that are congruent with a person's gender identity. So if I had known that this person had Y chromosomes, I might have brought that up in my letter to immigration. I might have, but what I would not have done is I would not have said, he has a Y chromosome, therefore he is a man. I would have said, he has a Y chromosome and he is a man, and you should correct his documents to reflect that. And the reason for that is, you want to avoid creating precedent which looks to any particular physical marker of sex as being definitive, because while it might help your client in that case, it might hurt the next client who comes along who has a very similar story, but one feature is different. So what we're trying to do is to get the law to match up with where medicine is right now, which is, at least on paper, medicine is saying that the gender identity is the paramount marker. Okay, my next story. This is an asylum story. I'm calling this person Amadou. Amadou is an asylum applicant from a West African country who had come into Florida. And this is how he told his story. He said that he was born with ambiguous genitals and raised as a boy. And at puberty, it was discovered that he had a hernia, and he underwent hernia repair surgery. And when they opened him up to do the hernia repair, they discovered that he had uterine structures inside his body. So it was already known that he had ambiguous genitals, and he was living, for better or for worse, in some way, and this often happens in his culture. He was getting by with that, and living as a boy, and being more or less accepted in that role. I don't really know what his life was like before the surgery. When the doctors opened him up and found these uterine structures, they decided that he was really a girl. And this is in line with some older practices of medicine that are considered out of date in this country, although I can't say they're never happening. But in other countries, you know, it's really catch as catch can what a doctor's going to know about these conditions. So they decided he was really a girl, and at that point they decided he should be a woman. They removed his testes and they performed genital surgery to feminize him, to make him look female without his consent. So this poor kid, who was getting by with whatever challenges he had, you know, he went in for surgery for a hernia, and he woke up and he was told he was a woman, and his body had been changed, and that he had to live that way for the rest of his life. So obviously, then also his entire community was therefore now aware of his intersex condition, and responded with extreme persecution, violence, death threats. We do see all the kinds of persecution that are addressed toward the LGBT community also being addressed toward the intersex community. It's assumed that they're gender variant in some way. And so he left and made his way to Florida through, you know, a variety of passages, and I'm sure you all have heard these kinds of stories before. And when he started this asylum process, he got a medical exam from a general practitioner at a community clinic in Florida who was helping this immigration project that he was working with. And she didn't believe his story. She looked at him, she saw what looked to her like typical female genitals. She didn't find scars consistent with feminizing genital surgery. And she thought he was transgender, that he wished he was a man, and that he was lying. So that's bad, as you know. Credibility is a big issue here. And there were some details of his story that seemed very improbable. He said he had testes and a uterine structure. That is very, very uncommon. Even a doctor familiar with intersex conditions might think that's not possible. It is the kind of story someone might make up. There were also some details of his story that were very suggestive of truth, like this being discovered during a hernia repair. That is actually a very common way that intersex conditions are discovered, and is the sort, to my mind, is the sort of detail that someone's not likely to make up. It's not a very romantic detail. It's not something somebody would know. So, you know, he had this mixed kind of story. And it's important to understand a couple things in hearing these stories. One is, only a small number of medical specialists are really knowledgeable about these conditions. A general practitioner may be willing to make pronouncements, as that one was, but those pronouncements may be inaccurate. And I know, you know, a lot of times in the field you're going to have to deal with whatever medical help you have, but it's important to know that really there are really only a handful of specialists.